After more than 100 successful trips through Climax Cave, Bruce Brewer could navigate its passages blindfolded. On July 12, 2003, that expertise killed him. Bruce Brewer was the kind of person who found beauty in places most people would never want to go. While others spent weekends at beaches or shopping malls, Bruce was drawn to holes in the ground. Specifically, the kind that drop into absolute darkness and don't come with guarantees you'll find your way back out. At 33, he'd been serious about caving for more than a decade. Not the tourist kind of caving where you walk through well-lit chambers on paved paths, but real caving. The kind where you army crawl through spaces barely wider than your shoulders, where your headlamp is the only thing standing between you and complete sensory deprivation, and where getting stuck isn't a hypothetical concern, but a very real possibility that keeps you awake some nights. Bruce wasn't reckless, though. Ask anyone who knew him in the tight-knit Georgia caving community, and they'd tell you he was methodical, careful, even gentle in the way he moved through underground spaces. He had this rare combination of technical skill and genuine reverence for the environment he was exploring. While some cavers approach caves like conquests to be dominated, Bruce treated them more like ancient libraries to be studied and preserved. He understood something that a lot of people don't. Caves are living systems. They breathe with changes in atmospheric pressure. They grow with mineral deposits that accumulate grain by grain over millennia. They change seasonally as water tables rise and fall. They have moods that shift with weather patterns on the surface, sometimes hundreds of feet above. And if you don't respect that dynamic relationship, if you assume they'll behave the same way every time, they'll teach you respect the hard way. His favorite classroom was Climax Cave, tucked into the pine woods of southwest Georgia, near a town so small it makes other small towns feel cosmopolitan. The town of Climax, yes, that's really its name, and yes, cavers make all the obvious jokes, has maybe 300 residents on a good day. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the post office doubles as the town social center, and where a cave entrance in the woods is just another part of the landscape that most locals take for granted. But that cave entrance represents something extraordinary. What looks like just another sinkhole depression in the forest floor, the kind you might step around while hiking without giving it a second thought, actually leads to nearly 8 miles of mapped passages winding through Paleozoic limestone bedrock. It's the second longest dry cave in Georgia, though dry is a relative term that would be amusing to anyone who spent time crawling through its mud-slick passages. The entrance itself is deceptive. From above, you see a roughly circular depression, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by pine trees and understory vegetation that seems determined to reclaim the opening. Peer over the edge, though, and you're looking into a 30-foot vertical drop that requires rope work to navigate safely. It's like a portal to another world, which in many ways it is. By 2003, Bruce had been through Climax more than 100 times. He knew its personality the way you know an old friend's mannerisms. He knew that the entrance required a rope-assisted descent, and that your first few minutes underground would be spent getting oriented in near-total darkness while your eyes adjusted to the reality of headlamp-only vision. He knew that 3 main passages split off from the bottom like fingers, and that each had its own distinct character. The first passage was technically challenging, wide enough to be comfortable, but requiring rope work for several vertical sections. Experienced cavers loved it because it felt adventurous without being genuinely dangerous. The second passage was a different story entirely. A vertical squeeze that could make even seasoned cavers question their life choices. It was passable, but it required a specific technique and a certain comfort level with having rock walls pressing against your chest and back simultaneously. The third passage was the most user-friendly, though it often featured a thin waterfall that would soak you to the bone and remind you that you were, in fact, hundreds of feet underground in a place where getting cold could become a serious problem. Once you committed to going deeper than these entrance passages, Climax became a choose-your-own-adventure book written by geological forces over millions of years. Tight crawls that forced you to exhale to squeeze through would suddenly open into cathedral-like chambers where your headlamp beam couldn't reach the ceiling. Belly crawl passages that made you question your sanity would unexpectedly drop into rooms so large that shouting wouldn't produce an echo. And then, just when you started feeling confident about the cave's layout, it would funnel you into a passage so constricted that you'd have to remove your helmet and push it ahead of you. The cave had its own climate system, too. Temperature remained constant year-round at about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool enough to be uncomfortable without proper clothing, warm enough that hypothermia wasn't an immediate concern. Humidity stayed near 100%, which meant that everything you brought into the cave would be damp by the time you came out. Air circulation was generally good, though some of the deeper passages could feel stuffy, especially when you were working hard and navigate difficult terrain. One of the most memorable and notorious spots deep in the system was Razor Hall, a large chamber suspended over a dark pool, decorated with thin, sharp-looking speleothems that gave the room its ominous name. The formations weren't actually razor-sharp, but they looked menacing in headlamp light, and the acoustics of the chamber gave every sound an eerie quality that made even experienced cavers speak in hushed tones. Razor Hall was beautiful in that unsettling way that underground spaces can be, but was also a critical checkpoint in any deep cave trip. The water level in the pool that dominated the chamber floor could make or break your ability to continue deeper into the system. When the water was low, you could walk along a narrow ledge that hugged the chamber wall, carefully picking your way around rock projections to reach a low opening that led to the next major room. When the water was high, you had a problem. I should mention here that cave flooding isn't like regular flooding that you might experience on the surface. When surface water rises, you can usually see it happening. You have warning signs, darkening skies, weather forecasts, the sound of increasing rainfall. You have options, higher ground, evacuation routes, emergency services with boats and helicopters. Underground, rising water is fundamentally different. It's silent, it's patient, and it doesn't give you the courtesy of advance warning or obvious escape routes. Cave hydrology is also counterintuitive. Water levels underground don't necessarily correspond to surface conditions in predictable ways. A rainstorm that happened days ago and hundreds of miles away might affect passage conditions. Seasonal water table changes can create conditions that even local experts haven't seen before. And because cave systems are three-dimensional networks, water can back up in unexpected places when drainage patterns shift. Bruce understood this better than most, which is why what happened on July 12, 2003, was so shocking to everyone who knew him. That morning started like dozens of similar days Bruce had experienced over the years. He was leading a group of 7 researchers from a local ecological center into Climax Cave. These weren't experienced cavers. Most had never been underground before, but they weren't casual tourists either. They were professional scientists with advanced degrees and a specific research mission to study the cave's bat population in their natural habitat, recording echolocation calls and observing behaviors that simply can't be studied in laboratory conditions. The research team included biologists, an acoustic specialist, and a graduate student working on a thesis about bat colony dynamics. They've been planning this expedition for months, coordinating schedules, gathering specialized recording equipment, and studying maps of the cave system. For them, this wasn't adventure tourism. It was serious fieldwork that could contribute to broader understanding of cave ecosystem dynamics and bat conservation strategies. For Bruce, this was routine work, though he never treated any cave trip as truly routine. Guide intelligent but inexperienced people into the underground environment, show them the ecosystem they wanted to study, keep everyone safe and comfortable, bring everyone home with a positive experience and useful data. He'd led similar trips dozens of times for various research groups, school classes, and scientific organizations. The planned route was straightforward by Climax Cave standards, a few thousand feet of crawling and climbing that would take them through several bat colony areas and back out again via a different route. Nothing extreme, nothing that would require advanced technical skills, just a solid day underground that would give the researchers access to the bat populations they needed to observe. The circuit Bruce had planned would keep them in the more accessible parts of the cave system, while still providing genuine cave experience and excellent research opportunities. The group met at the cave entrance around 10:30 in the morning, and Bruce spent the first half hour doing what he always did: equipment checks, safety briefings, and setting expectations. He explained how headlamps worked, how to move efficiently through tight spaces, what to do if someone got stuck, how to communicate in the echoing environment of cave passages. He talked about leave no trace principles as they applied to cave environments, emphasizing how fragile underground ecosystems could be. They dropped into the entrance around 11 o'clock and immediately encountered one of caving's universal constants: mud. Lots of it. The kind of red Georgia clay that sticks to everything and makes every surface slippery. But this was expected, part of the authentic cave experience that you can't really prepare people for until they're actually underground and dealing with it. Bruce had learned over the years that people's reactions to their first real cave experience were unpredictable. Some took to it immediately, reveling in the alien environment and the physical challenges. Others became claustrophobic or anxious and needed constant reassurance. This group was handling it well. They were focused on their research objectives and seemed genuinely excited about being underground. They moved through the cave at the deliberate pace that such trips require, steady but not rushed, with frequent stops for equipment adjustments, water breaks, explanation of geological features, and the occasional moment of wonder when someone's headlamp illuminated a formation they'd never imagined existed. The bats were active, filling the larger chambers with their ultrasonic calls and providing exactly the research opportunities the team had hoped for. The acoustic specialist was having a field day, recording echolocation patterns that varied significantly from what had been documented in other cave systems. The biologists were observing roosting behaviors and estimating population sizes. The graduate student was taking detailed notes about colony distribution and chamber preferences. From a research perspective, the trip was already successful. Hours passed in that timeless way that cave trips create. Without natural light cycles or familiar reference points, your internal clock becomes unreliable. You exist in a bubble of LED headlamp light, focused on the immediate challenge of the next crawl, the next climb, the next narrow passage that requires you to trust that your light will reveal a way forward. Time becomes measured in passages completed, formations observed, data points collected. Bruce was pleased with how the group was performing. They'd maintained good spirits despite the physical demands, shown appropriate caution in challenging passages, and demonstrated the kind of focused enthusiasm that made guide work rewarding. The research objectives were being met, everyone was staying safe, and they were making good time through the planned route. By early evening, though evening is meaningless when you're thousands of feet underground in perpetual darkness, they reached Razor Hall. This should have been a simple checkpoint in their planned circuit. Cross the chamber, duck through the low passage in a turnage room, continue through a few more manageable passages, and they'd be on the home stretch back to the surface with a successful research expedition completed. But when Bruce approached the dark pool that dominated Razor Hall's floor, something was immediately wrong. The water level was higher than he'd ever seen it in over 100 visits to this chamber. Much higher. The narrow ledge that normally ran along the chamber wall, the path that allowed safe passage around the pool to the next room, was completely submerged under several feet of dark, still water. Now, experienced cavers develop an instinct for reading these situations. You learn to interpret the cave's subtle signals, to recognize when conditions have shifted from normal to potentially problematic. The air felt different in Razor Hall that day, more humid, slightly warmer, with a quality that suggested water levels throughout the system might be elevated. Bruce was processing these signs now, and they weren't reassuring. The only way forward through their planned route was through a sump, an underwater passage that connected Razor Hall to Turnage Room under normal water conditions. Bruce had swum through this passage before, though not often and never when water levels were this high. Under typical conditions, it might be a short, straightforward underwater swim with an adequate air gap at the top of the passage. But conditions weren't typical. The elevated water level meant that air gap might be reduced or eliminated entirely. It meant swimming blind through flooded cave passage with no guarantee of finding breathable air on the other side. This is where Bruce faced a decision that, in hindsight, seems obviously problematic. But hindsight is a luxury that people making split-second decisions in challenging environments don't have access to. Bruce was weighing several competing factors simultaneously, trying to make the best decision based on incomplete information and time pressure. The research group was tired after hours of challenging underground travel. They'd been crawling through mud, climbing over rock formations, and navigating passages that demanded constant attention and physical effort. Retracing their route back through the cave system would mean several more hours of difficult passage work. And some of the researchers were already showing signs of fatigue that could make the return trip genuinely challenging. They were also close to completing their planned circuit. Turnage Room was right there, just through a short underwater section that Bruce had successfully navigated before. The researchers had specific scientific objectives that wouldn't be fully met if they turned back now. They'd invested significant time and effort in this expedition, and the data they were collecting was genuinely valuable for ongoing conservation research. Perhaps most importantly, Bruce's experience and expertise were telling him that the situation was manageable. He'd been cave diving informally for years. He understood the risks of sump diving, but he also understood his own capabilities. This wasn't a long, complex underwater passage. It was a short swim through familiar territory to reach a chamber he'd been in dozens of times. What Bruce couldn't know was that recent rainfall patterns had altered the cave's hydrology in subtle but critical ways. Water that normally drained efficiently through lower passages was backing up due to blockages or seasonal changes in the regional water table. Passages that were usually just damp were becoming fully flooded sumps. The cave was in a transitional hydrological state, and transitional states in cave systems are inherently unpredictable and potentially dangerous. He made the decision that many experienced cavers might have made in the same situation, given the same information and time constraints. He would personally check the flooded passage. If he could make it through safely, if there was adequate airspace and turnage room on the other side, he would return and guide the group through. If conditions weren't safe, they'd find an alternative route out of the cave system. Bruce explained his plan to the research group in calm, reassuring terms. He was going to swim ahead to check conditions in the next chamber. They should wait in Razor Hall, conserve their light batteries, and he'd be back in a few minutes with a report on whether the passage was safe for the entire group. He began preparing for the dive with the systematic approach that characterized everything he did underground. He removed excess gear that might create drag or get caught on rock formations. He checked his headlamp to ensure it was securely attached and functioning properly. He took several minutes to study the water surface, looking for clues about current patterns or obstacles beneath the surface. The water in cave pools has a particular quality that's hard to describe to people who haven't experienced it. It's incredibly clear, clearer than most surface water, but also completely black due to the absence of light. It maintains a constant temperature that feels shockingly cold when you first enter it, especially when you're already chilled from hours in the 58-degree cave environment. And it's absolutely still, without the ripples or movement that might give you information about depth or underwater topography. Bruce slipped into the dark water without drama or fanfare, the way someone might enter a swimming pool. The cold was immediate and breathtaking, but he'd experienced cave water before and knew what to expect. He spent a moment getting oriented, floating at the surface, and studying the submerged rock formations that marked the passage entrance. Then he began the breathing preparation that free divers use to maximize their time underwater. Several deep, controlled breaths to saturate his blood with oxygen. A brief period of hyperventilation to reduce carbon dioxide levels and delay the reflexive urge to breathe. And finally, one enormous breath that filled his lungs to capacity. Bruce Brewer disappeared beneath the surface of the pool in Razor Hall, his headlamp creating a faint glow that penetrated a few feet into the black water before fading entirely. The research group waited in the chamber, their collective headlamps creating a small circle of light in the vast darkness that surrounded them. The acoustics of Razor Hall made every small sound seem amplified. The drip of water from formations, the subtle shift of someone adjusting their position on the rocky floor, the barely audible hum of LED headlamps. Seconds passed, then a minute. Someone in the group mentioned that they could see a faint glow coming from beyond the rock wall that separated them from Turnage Room, presumably Bruce's light on the other side of the underwater passage. This seemed encouraging. It suggested that he'd made it through successfully and was checking conditions in the next chamber. But then the glow began to fade, and then it disappeared entirely. They waited longer, calling Bruce's name into the darkness, their voices echoing off the chamber walls and returning with no response. The silence that followed was oppressive in the way that only underground silence could be, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of massive amounts of rock and earth that seemed to absorb their words and give nothing back. Several group members crawled to the edge of the pool and reached into the cold water, hoping to feel movement, to grab a hand or a piece of equipment, to make contact with Bruce in some way. The water was still and empty. Their searching hands found only rock and mud. The horrible realization crept over them gradually, the way that devastating news often does. Bruce wasn't coming back. Something had gone wrong during that short dive, and they were now alone in Razor Hall, deep underground, with their guide and their exit route both suddenly and inexplicably gone. Now, they faced their own seemingly impossible decision. They were thousands of feet underground in a complex cave system with someone who knew every passage intimately, and that person had simply vanished. They had rough maps and basic navigation skills, but caves are three-dimensional puzzles where a wrong turn can lead to hours of additional crawling through passages that all look identical in headlamp light. But they couldn't stay in Razor Hall. They had to get to the surface and get help. Bruce might be trapped somewhere, might be unconscious but alive, might be in a situation where rapid rescue could make the difference between life and death. The trip back toward the cave entrance became a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Every tight squeeze raised the question, what if we get stuck here too? Every passage junction forced them to make navigation decisions based on incomplete information and growing anxiety. Every chamber they entered might or might not be familiar from their earlier passage through the cave. They had enough collective light and intelligence to eventually find their way out, but the journey seemed to take forever. Hours passed in a blur of mud, rock, and the gradually growing fear that they might not be able to retrace their route successfully. Some passages looked familiar. Others seemed completely foreign. The cave that had seemed fascinating and manageable a few hours earlier now felt hostile and maze-like. Finally, impossibly, they began to see something that none of them had realized they'd been desperately hoping for. The faint suggestion of natural light filtering down from above. The entrance to Climax Cave appeared ahead of them like a glimpse of another world. And by the time the first group members emerged onto the surface, it was nearly midnight. They immediately contacted local law enforcement, but this wasn't a situation that sheriff's deputies could handle effectively. Cave rescue requires specialized skills, equipment, and knowledge that most emergency services don't maintain. You can't just send someone with a flashlight and a rope into a complex cave system and expect positive results. The call went out through the Regional Caving Communities Emergency Network to Will Summer, a local caver who knew Climax Cave as intimately as Bruce had. Will understood immediately what had likely happened and what needed to be done. This wasn't going to be a quick rescue operation. This was going to be a body recovery that would require careful planning and substantial resources. Will gathered his own equipment and contacted 2 police divers who had some cave diving experience, though nothing approaching the technical expertise that the situation really demanded. By the early morning hours of July 13th, they were rappelling back into the cave entrance to begin the grim work of finding Bruce and bringing him home. The return journey to Razor Hall was faster than the original research expedition had been, but no less ominous. Will and the divers knew the cave well enough to navigate efficiently, and they weren't stopping to observe bats or collect scientific data. They were moving with the focused urgency of people who understood that time mattered, even though they all suspected that Bruce was already beyond help. They reached the flooded chamber around 2:30 a.m., and the situation was immediately clear. The water level was indeed much higher than normal, and the underwater passage that connected to Turnage Room was completely flooded with no visible air gap. We'll study the conditions carefully, trying to understand what Bruce might have been thinking when he made the decision to attempt the dive. It didn't take long for the divers to find Bruce's body. He was pinned beneath the rock partition that separated Razor Hall from Turnage Room, caught in the narrow underwater passage where he'd run out of air and lost consciousness. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence that he'd fought to free himself or attempted to swim back toward Razor Hall. It appeared that he'd simply become wedged in the restricted passage, been unable to continue forward or retreat backward, and drowned when his breath ran out. Whether he'd gotten disoriented in the zero visibility conditions, whether the passage had shifted slightly due to water pressure, or whether he'd simply misjudged the distance and the degree of restriction, no one would ever know for certain. What was clear was that Bruce had died doing something he was exceptionally skilled at, in a place he knew better than almost anywhere else, on what should have been a routine day underground. Finding Bruce's body was only the beginning of an extraordinarily complex and emotionally draining recovery operation. Getting his body out of Climax Cave would require a massive undertaking that would test every aspect of cave rescue technique and community cooperation. The logistics alone were staggering. Nearly 8,000 feet of passage work, much of it through spaces barely wide enough for a single person, all while managing the additional challenge of moving someone who could no longer help with the process. Over the next 13 hours, more than 100 people participated in the recovery effort. Cavers drove from neighboring states to help. Local fire departments provided equipment, personnel, and logistical support. Emergency medical technicians waited at the surface. Friends of Bruce's took time off work to participate in an operation that everyone knew would be physically and emotionally grueling. The recovery became a testament to the cave community's unwritten but absolute commitment to bringing their own people home, regardless of the difficulty or danger involved. Teams worked in shifts to maintain continuous progress through the cave's most challenging sections. Every tight squeeze required careful planning and execution. Every vertical section needed specialized rigging. Every decision balanced the urgency of the mission against the safety of the living people participating in the recovery. As Bruce's body was slowly moved through the cave system, passage by passage, chamber by chamber, the operation took on an almost ritualistic quality. This was more than just a technical rescue operation. It was a community saying goodbye to someone who had dedicated years of his life to exploring and protecting underground environments. At 4:19 a.m. on July 14th, nearly 48 hours after Bruce had entered Climax Cave for what should have been a routine research expedition, his body finally reached the surface. There was no celebration, no sense of victory or accomplishment, just exhausted relief that a friend and colleague was finally coming home to his family and community. The official investigation into Bruce's death was straightforward and unsurprising. Accidental drowning due to entrapment in a flooded cave passage. No equipment failure, no violation of established safety protocols, no evidence of reckless behavior or poor judgment. Just a series of small decisions and minor environmental factors that aligned in the worst possible way to create a tragedy that no one could have predicted or prevented. What haunts people who knew Bruce isn't that he died doing something dangerous or foolhardy. Cave diving in flooded passages carries inherent risks that everyone in the community understands and respects. What's devastating is that he died doing something he was exceptionally good at, in a place he'd explored successfully more than 100 times, on a day when everything should have gone exactly according to plan. The caving community learned from Bruce's death in the methodical way that it learns from every serious accident. Sump diving protocols were discussed and refined at regional meetings. The importance of conservative decision-making in changing hydrological conditions was emphasized in training programs and safety workshops. Climax Cave itself was studied more carefully to understand how its water levels could shift so dramatically with seemingly minor changes in surface weather patterns. But the larger lesson was one that experienced cavers already knew intellectually, but sometimes forgot emotionally. Expertise creates its own categories of risk. When you're genuinely skilled at something, when you've done it successfully hundreds of times, it becomes psychologically easy to push the boundaries of acceptable risk. Confidence built on extensive experience can become a liability when conditions change in subtle ways that expertise doesn't immediately recognize. The cave doesn't maintain a record of your previous successes. It doesn't give you credit for years of careful, conservative decision-making. Each trip is independent. Each decision carries its own consequences, and the underground environment's final judgment is always absolute and unforgiving. Bruce Brewer died doing what he genuinely loved, in a place he'd explored and protected and shared with others for over a decade. His death wasn't meaningless. The safety discussions and protocol refinements that followed have undoubtedly prevented other accidents. But it was a stark reminder that even the most experienced and cautious adventurers are ultimately visitors in environments that operated according to physical laws for millions of years before humans existed, and will continue operating according to those same laws long after our species is gone. The cave doesn't care how well you know it, how much you respect it, or how carefully you've planned your visit. It's going to do what caves do. Respond to hydrological pressures, seasonal variations, and geological forces that operate on timescales that make human experience seem momentary. And sometimes, despite everyone's best intentions and most careful preparations, that's simply enough to change everything.